The state of racial justice and human rights. I'm going to read you the description of this. I know it's in the program, but just for information's sake. Issues of global civil liberties and human rights are a part of the social and structural context of schools. These macro and micro contexts of educational wrongs are essential to ameliorating racial injustices and indignities, as well as other human rights issues. More than 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, many students continue to struggle in educational environments. The educational ecology has not been friendly to those who are othered in society, such as those of a certain race, color, religion, gender, class, sexuality, citizenship, disability, or national origin. The dream of full equality remains an elusive one. Children are amongst the most vulnerable populations, and as such, educators must understand human rights frameworks in order to become advocates for those who are often underserved. This session focuses on barriers to human rights and dignities and the role of education in action and advocacy to ensure equitable outcomes. The speakers were given some prompts, and so I'm going to let you know what those questions were, and then I'll turn it over to them after some brief introductions. So the prompts are, what is the current state of racial justice and human rights from a global perspective? What are current priority areas impacting students in schools? And what are the roles of those in leadership positions who can impact policy? So in order to address those questions today, we have Dr. Felisa Tibbitts and Dr. Joshua Starr. We did have a third panelist, Emily Carson, but she got the flu, so she was unable to make it. Dr. Felisa Tibbitts is the founder and senior advisor of Human Rights Education Associates, which she directed from 1999 through 2010. She is an affiliated professor with the Institute of Reconciliation and Social Justice at the University of Free State in South Africa. In the past, she has been an adjunct faculty member at Harvard University, Columbia University, and the UN University for Peace. She has worked with numerous government and international agencies in developing curriculum and policies that support the integration of human rights into teaching and training, including the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and numerous non-governmental agencies such as Amnesty International. She has engaged in adult trainings in over 20 countries, serves on numerous advisory committees, and has published articles, book chapters, and manuals addressing such topics as human rights education in schools and the empowerment model of human rights education. To her left is Dr. Joshua Starr. He is the superintendent of Montgomery County Public Schools, which is the nation's 17th largest school district. Dr. Starr is a tireless advocate for students and a strong believer that public schools must focus their policies and practices on the skills and knowledge that students need for success. Since arriving at Montgomery County Public Schools in 2011, Dr. Starr has overseen a renewed district-wide focus on professional development, timely interventions, and community engagement, as well as the continued implementation of the Common Core state standards. He has overseen the development of a new strategic planning framework that is aligned to the 3 competencies students need for success in the 21st century: academic excellence, creative problem solving, and social emotional learning. Dr. Starr uses a variety of ways to engage his community, from face-to-face town hall meetings and book clubs to podcasts and Twitter, where thousands of people follow his Twitter feed, which I have here in case you want to follow it, but I'm sure he'll let you know as well. He has been recognized nationally for his advocacy for educators and school staff. Moreover, he believes that the best way to improve education is to improve teaching and learning for every student every day. Dr. Starr received his doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and has a distinguished career that began as a special education teacher in New York City and has included leadership positions in both urban and suburban districts. And I'd like to also add, he's a Wisconsin Badger, much like myself, so that's an extra bonus. So please join me in welcoming them both. And with that, each presenter will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and after that, we'll have time for questions from the audience and the group of attendants here. With that, we'll start with Dr. Tibbitts.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Nice to see you here. We weren't sure on a Saturday afternoon if we would still have people coming to our session, but we're glad that you're here, and I'm delighted to be here as well. Thank you so much for inviting me to present. I've never attended this conference, and in fact, I don't actually very often present in the United States, so I actually feel a bit nervous about it, but I'm hoping that I can share with you some ideas and some examples from both the US and abroad that will address the very interesting questions that were posed around human rights as a norm, as a framework, and social justice in education in schools. So with that, let me explain what I'm going to try to do today in 10 minutes. First of all, I thought that what would be relevant to begin with is a very light introduction to the idea of the right to education, which in the world of human rights, which I assume in, is a fairly standard lingo. So I'm going to explain sort of where that comes from and some of the very general ideas behind that, because I think it's relevant for this session. I'm going to very lightly touch on the challenges, because I think if you're working in education, whether you're teaching at higher education or doing research, or if you're like Josh in the trenches, so to speak, you know full well what the challenges are. But I'll present a few points around that, and then present the idea of human rights education, which is the field I work in, as partly an antidote or a process, a mechanism for trying to address injustices in schools, human rights abuses, and a couple examples. So you see, it's a fairly full program. I'm sorry that our third speaker is sick with the flu, but that means I get 2 extra minutes with you, so I'm going to use those as well as I can. So I don't know have any of you heard of the right to education before? Could you put your hands up if you have? You've heard of it. Well, that's reassuring. I don't know if you've actually looked at where that comes from and what it's constituted by, but I'm going to touch lightly on a number of topics, and if there's interest, we can go more into it in the discussion. So the idea of the right to education, and any rights, are associated with various treaties, or also known as standards, in the human rights system, the international human rights system. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was kind of the foundational document for all the treaties that ensued, and which was issued in 1948, mentioned the role of education in promoting understanding of freedom and human rights. But we also have the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Neither of those the U.S. has ratified. They have signed but not ratified, but nevertheless the right to education is found in those documents. And when you have them in those documents, that means that they have some meaning. Even if a country hasn't ratified these documents, they're norms of sorts internationally. And specifically, the right to education calls for the right to free compulsory education. Those are put together. And specifically, and this is particularly relevant for this panel, the right to education encompasses the obligation to rule out discrimination at all levels of the educational system and to set minimum standards for the improvement of quality education. So this is perhaps something you'd expect to be there, and indeed this has been identified as part of the right to education, that non-discrimination, which is a very central human rights value, will be respected. But there is in the UN system, there are special rapporteurs. I don't know if you've heard of that notion, special rapporteurs. You have? Yay. There are people in the UN system, they're appointed by the Human Rights Council. They're usually academics, actually, who in their spare time, or in time that's given to them by their deans, is associated with a particular right, and that they're usually appointed for about 4 years, 5 years, and during their tenure, they go to countries at the invitation of the countries and do specific research, actually, on the conditions of the rights. And there is a special rapporteur on the right to education, has been now for at least 20 years. And Katarina Tomaszewski, who was originally from Croatia, elaborated. She was a very earnest advocate for the right to education when she had her tenure, and she elaborated the 4 A's framework. So again, this is a little bit more on the human rights background for the right to education. You can see for yourself availability of education, accessibility, again, this gets to non-discrimination, acceptability, this has to do with how it's delivered. This is going to seem familiar to you, I think, and then adaptability as well. So I won't get into these, but these are all frames that we use very specifically in examining the degree to which educational systems at a national level, also subnational level, are really in line with the principles of the right to education. There's more there. So the impediments to the right to education, which is another way of looking at the questions for this panel, are widespread. I pulled off a few here facts for us. Globally, more than 72 million children who should be in school at the primary school level are not in school. And typically that's because of marginalization and poverty. In the US, over 1 million young people drop out of school each year, and millions more are receiving a substandard education. We have challenges whether we put those numbers at 1 million or 500,000. Another way of looking at these is that the right to education is being denied. Specifically, and these are conditions that I think we find in many countries, classrooms are overcrowded, they lack adequate resources, students and teachers both face degrading environments, and schools use harsh, punitive discipline practices that deny students the opportunity to learn. So, we could go on. I don't want to belabor these, but they're challenges. And again, these from the human rights framework are seen as rights to education being violated. So now I want to switch to another area. This is the area that I'm working in a lot, which is human rights education. This is a lot of text, I'm sorry about that. This is actually an abridged, a truncated version of a longer definition of human rights education, which is in the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. There is such a thing, and it came out a couple of years ago. It's the culmination of about 20 years' work inside of the UN and outside the UN, those of us who have been working in this field, to try to define what it is about. So I've put in yellow highlights the parts that I want to draw your attention to. One is that human rights education is ultimately about preventing human rights violations. So that's kind of conditional on understanding what the violations is. Again, that's where I started with the right to education, because the denial of quality education, push out, dropout, this is the result. Can be seen as a failure to deliver the right to education. So human rights education is about helping those kinds of things not happen. Moreover, like other educational areas, human rights education has competencies related to knowledge, skills, and also actions. Empowerment is super key to this, because human rights education is about ultimately knowing and being able to claim your own rights, and also to help to ensure the rights of others as well. So this action piece is really important. Another part of human rights education I just wanted to mention very briefly, this comes again from the Declaration. The Declaration isn't like a treaty. A treaty in the human rights system is like the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which the US has signed, it's ratified. That means that it's obligated voluntarily to uphold these principles. A declaration doesn't have that kind of weight. It did pass the General Assembly at the UN in December of 2011, but it's really just sending a signal. So with declarations, it's even though the UN might urge governments to abide by it, and the US also supported this declaration, it's soft. It's considered a soft standard. But nevertheless, in this declaration is a clear message that it's the responsibility of governments, including the US, to actually deliver human rights education. Because if you have any faith in the human rights system, and you may have more or less degrees of optimism or faith about it, but nevertheless, the whole system is sort of riding on the foundation that governments understand what their human rights obligations are, and they implement them. And we, as everyday people, citizens, know what our rights are and able to claim them and advocate for them if they're not fully realized. So this language is also in the Declaration. Now, human rights education, I'm just going to say a little bit about this and then move to my examples. It's been broken out, and I think this is really nice. I have to say this is kind of a culmination of a couple of decades of experience. Really, what is it about? Human rights education is partly about knowing what the standards are, of course. That's fairly fundamental. to HRE, but it's also through human rights, meaning that democratic practices, respecting the dignity of the learners in the classroom, and it's not just for schools, by the way. Human rights education and training that applies to law enforcement officials, the military, social workers, it's public education in general. So it's in fact very relevant for all kinds. It's intended for all sectors. So I just want to mention that we're focusing on schools here, but it's for everyone. And anyway, through human rights, especially this piece becomes very relevant when we're talking about trainings of, say, social workers or law enforcement officials, where military academies may be a little bit less oriented towards democratic principles of education, as maybe you all are in schools or in higher education. So the through piece is pretty important. It also takes us outside the classroom to the environments in which human rights education is taking place, because in many societies that I work in, say post-conflict societies or post-authoritarian societies, you sometimes find these like really activist teachers who are really excited about human rights education, and learners in their classroom have a wonderful experience, and then they step outside the classroom and it's a very top-down, hierarchical, and sometimes unfriendly environment for young people. So this is pushing us beyond that. Education for human rights gets us back to that point that it's all about what happens afterwards. It's not, it's unlike other kinds of subjects in school. It really is all about what happens as a consequence of students participating in it. Does it really result in affirming values that we think are essential, like respect for others? Does it result in their really taking a stand when it's called for in their school or community? The human rights-based approach, again, I'm taking the opportunity to give you a little bit of kind of a cliff notes on human rights language that's relevant for this topic. The human rights-based approach is something that's been introduced about 12 years ago in the UN family, and it's now migrating out to development organizations. And the principle is that that the human rights framework in general informs us about ways of working, and that includes, for example, participatory processes, in terms of schools, that schools are collaborating with communities and civil society organizations, and that if they are working in the area of rights, that those areas are determined by the beneficiaries and not sort of top down. So now I want to give you two examples of human rights education, really, or in the human rights-based approach, so there's something more grounded in what I've just presented to you. This will go fairly quickly. I'm appreciating I had a little extra time. So human rights education is happening all over the world. It's at different stages of development in school systems. In India, there have been strong efforts made for years, actually, through various NGOs to promote human rights education. And the Institute for Human Rights Education is a very unique NGO in India, partly because it's actually a kind of adjunct of a very hardcore human rights group called People's Watch, and they've oriented a lot of their work around promoting the rights of the untouchables, the caste. They've worked a lot in southern India. So since 1997, the Institute for Human Rights Education has had a collaborative process with government schools, and they basically have been training teachers in these schools to carry out human rights education oriented on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And massive numbers of teachers and students have been involved. And the idea is to actually not only work with the teachers, but the teachers to introduce to these young people the principles of human rights and knowing and claiming their rights, but especially dealing with issues of caste discrimination, corporal punishment in school, and also female dropout and early marriage, which has impeded girls completing their education in this part of India for sure. So there was some research that was carried out by Monisha Bajaj. This was very welcomed in the field of HRE because it is very difficult to find evidence-based research, often because human rights education is infused within, say, civic education or other kinds of main subject areas. But in this case, because she was able to develop a research that allowed her to look at HRE and its impact on learners in 24 schools. And what they found, in fact, is that there were impacts on student behavior related to the kind of impacts that she documented, were that students were willing to intervene in situations of abuse, that they were reporting abuse in schools, they were spreading awareness of human rights, and that there were some other shifts that were happening also in their homes and schools. I mean, it was a very, it was a very challenging environment in that area that this HRE is taking place in, but it was very affirming to see these results. And just a second, I have a very 1-minute brief clip I want to explain before I show it where it's from. This website is called Path to Dignity. If you can see, it's the bottom of the screen in case you're interested. This is actually a 30-minute film that my NGO made with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We have stories about HRE impact. We have about 12 minutes on this program in India. So I'm showing you just a minute, which is sort of the testimonials of some of the students. But if you are interested in this topic and would like to know more, you might want to go to this website and just check out some of the videos. So yeah, if you could, thanks. Just for a minute.
There is a practice in some area, they won't send their girl child to the school. Some children are asking their parents, why you are not sending my sister to the school? She has a right. In a simple way, we can say each child can make a change through practicing the human rights values. That is important.
இங்கே வந்து டீச்சர்ஸ் கிளாஸ்க்குள்ளே வந்தாங்கன்னா கம்போட தான் வருவாங்க. ஆனால் இந்த மனித உரிமை கல்வி வந்த பிறகு டீச்சர்ஸ் எல்லாம் கம்பை விட்டுட்டு நல்லா அன்பாக பேசுகிற மாதிரி வராங்க.
எங்கள் பக்கத்து வீட்டுக்காரங்க ஒரு பொண்ணு வந்து சின்ன வயசுல நிச்சயதார்த்தம் பண்ணிட்டாங்க. 13 வயசு பிள்ளைய. இது பிள்ளை ஏன் பண்ணுறீங்கன்னாட்டா குடும்பத்தில் வறுமை தம்பி அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டாங்க. இதெல்லாம் தப்பு. அரசாங்கம் உங்களுக்கு படிக்கிறதுக்கு நல்ல பணம்லாம் செலவழிக்குது, படிக்க வைங்க அப்படின்னு சொன்னால் அவங்களும் படிக்க வச்சாங்க. அந்த நிச்சயதார்த்தம் நிறுத்திட்டு படிக்க வைக்கிறாங்க. அந்த பொண்ணு 9th படிச்சுட்டு இருக்கு.
Thank you. Great. So if we could go back to the PowerPoint, please. There's more there. It's really cool. Thanks. So what I did want to say, though, is when Manisha was studying this, she tried to understand what were the conditions under which we found that the kids were really, speaking up and taking action in the way that these testimonials showed. And what you did see, which again, I'm thinking this is going to reverberate with also your experiences in Montgomery County, and maybe some of you also were doing studies related to this because you're here in the room, so I'm thinking you're interested, is that for human rights education to be a transformative force, obviously teachers and headmasters had to be on board. It sounds obvious, but yes. And so it wasn't just a compliance, but they really had to be on board so that the teachers felt the comfort level in teaching human rights education and affirming whatever might happen in the schools as a result of kids really getting empowered and, asking teachers not to use the stick, for example. And other ingredients, I'm sorry for the text-heavy piece of this, but I didn't want to reduce this any further. Some ingredients that contributed to a more transformative role for the human rights education program included, not surprisingly, a good contact between the schools, the teachers, and the NGO, the nonprofit that was training the teachers, visits by the NGO staff to support the teachers in this work. I'm sure lots and lots of issues came up, that teachers were actually willing and able, interested to support student activism, because that's really what it came down to in some points. And then that the teachers were also themselves willing to intervene in situations of inequality or abuse in schools. So honestly, it was rather heroic, I think, what a lot of these teachers did in the students. And that's, I guess, part of what human rights education can engender. Maybe it's not the norm, but it's possible. And anyway, I find it very inspiring. Human rights education at home, my example here is a bit different, but it's again an example of a nonprofit or an NGO that has been using the human rights framework. That's not as common in the United States, that those folks interested in social justice or combating inequality actually use the human rights framework. The National Economic and Social Rights Institute is going against the flow in that way. They actually use the idea of the rights of the child. We haven't ratified the convention here in the US. We've signed it, but not ratified it. They nevertheless use that as their frame. And their education program, they're in New York City, by the way, is focused, they do different kinds of programs, but one is in the schools. And they're looking at school climate, discipline policies and police intervention, and also cultivating parent, youth, and teacher participation in decision-making. So even though the content is focused on the rights of the child, the frame is more the rights-based approach that I very briefly presented on, which is the idea of engagement, empowerment of community members, and so forth. So they actually work with programs, rather community partners, so they also work with like community service organizations in the places that they're working to actually carry out human rights documentation, analysis, advocacy, and training. They're working broadly in the States, but more depth in Los Angeles, just for your information, New Orleans, and New York City, if any of you are from there. They're also part of this, I don't know if you've heard of, has anyone heard of the Dignity in Schools campaign? If you're interested in this, in the reform in a way of discipline policies, that they're less punitive, then the Dignity in Schools campaign would be of interest to you. And if you're interested in researching it, that might be great. So it's a national coalition of 75 organizations from 22 states that are united to challenge the systemic program of push-out in schools that's related to discipline policies. So, the school push-out as a concept, like, you know, punitive policies, there's lots more on the website, which I have which I have there around where, you know, easy suspensions and expulsions result in kids just not coming back to school. You know, there's a lot of work around this, so I don't want to actually butcher it by trying to summarize it too briefly, but they're trying to work on discipline reform so that kids will stay in school, basically. And what I'm going to show now, just for 1 minute, and then I'm pretty much done, thanks for the extra time, is just an effort that was done in, I think it was in Los Angeles. It was a Stop School Push-Out campaign. It was just an organized effort, so if you could show that, then that'd be great. Thank you. This is our next video.
The fourth annual Week of Action on School Pushout took place from September 28th to October 5th, 2013. Youth, parents, and educators across 22 states called for an end to school pushout and for investment in education, not in
I'll see if you can get it. We can't do, that's okay. All right. Yeah, it's fine. No, you got the idea. So anyway, so I'm going to wrap up there. Thanks very much for your attention, and I hope that, I guess in summary, the idea was to show you some of the local, meaning the global locals, parallels in terms of challenges for the right to education, realizing it, human rights education, and the rights-based approaches, strategies for this, and I look forward to hearing your presentation and discussion afterwards. Thanks.
No, it's okay. It was so good.
Is it on? Yes? Yes? Any Montgomery County parents here? No? Good. Any press here? All right, good. Let's have some fun. Being in DC, I never know when there are Montgomery County parents around because we have a lot of them. So it's interesting listening to the presentation and thinking about how the issue of what kids have rights to has manifested itself in the U.S. in K-12 public education versus how it might manifest itself internationally, and the sickness that's pervaded K-12 public education in how the issue of rights has been just politicized is fascinating to me, which I won't get into or talk about today. Let me actually start by asking a question, if I may. What's the problem we're trying to solve in K-12 public education today? And this is like the interactive portion of the conversation. And I might even walk through and talk to some of you while I go. So what's the problem we're trying to solve in K-12 public education? Just one, yeah, the problem. Meaningful engagement of kids or of adults? Both, okay, meaningful engagement. What else? What's the problem? And by problem, let me be clear, not like, you know, my car broke down problem, but, you know, policy solutions follow problem definitions. So we always have to be really clear on what the problem is we're trying to solve. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? Yeah? Yep, graduating college and career ready. What else? Yeah? Curriculum with, I'm sorry, say the last part again? Yep. Curriculums, absolutely. What, anything else? The achievement gap, certainly. We'll talk about that in a minute. One other?
Lack of reading and writing capacity that leads to inability to be the kind of committed citizens we need to uphold the democracy.
Yep, sure. Skills. So I, all true. One more? All right, I'll go one more, yeah.
Well, the inequities in schools, but also the actual abuse that children are suffering after school day at the hands of
Abuse that kids are, okay. All true. So those are all parts of the problem. I choose to define the problem, however, because I have to organize systems around something, right? So I choose to define the problem that we face today as the democratization of information, right? More kids have access to more information than ever before. Anybody have the Overdrive app? Right, great app that enables you to access any, if you have a library card, you just put in your library card, and if your library is online, you can get any book, any ebook, whatever they have on this, right? More kids have access to more information than ever before in our lives, ever before. And it's changed the architecture of school districts and the ecology of the classroom, right? What adults have to do with kids has changed because no longer is the teacher the one who has the knowledge anymore. Well, they have the knowledge, but they don't have the information, deposits it in the head of the child. But the child now has access to things that they didn't before. Teachers do as well. And so the relationship between the teacher and the child and the content and the systems that exist around it has to fundamentally change. So that's what I try to do in running Montgomery County Public Schools, is try to figure out how to design systems that embrace the idea that kids have access to more information than they've ever had before, and we have to ask the question every day, if you can Google it, why teach it, right? Which doesn't mean you shouldn't teach it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't, but why? You actually have to think deeply. If a kid has access to something, now they can look it up right on their phone, and I have kids doing that every day. Why do I need to teach them it and quiz them on it, make them go home and memorize it, right? Why do that every day? And education systems have been organized around the depositing of knowledge into kids' heads for centuries, right? But we are encountering this huge shift. So Montgomery County Public Schools is 154,000 students. We're growing by 2,500 kids a year, 2,900 kids a year. Any of you run an education leadership program? Okay, so teach your budding superintendents about growth management and real estate management, because they didn't teach me anything about that. And I'm building new schools like every day. And I wish I had learned something about real estate management. That was a joke, just too late. All right, fine. So we're 154,000 kids. We're growing by 2,500 or so a year. We're a very, very diverse school district. About 14% of our kids are Asian, 22% African American, 27% Latino, although at the kindergarten, first and second grade level, Latino is now larger than the white population. It's about 31% or so. We're about 6% multi-ethnic, which leaves us about 34% white, and 35% of our kids receive free and reduced price meals, which is 54,000 kids. I always tell folks I have more kids in free and reduced price meals than DC has kids in its public schools. And 81% of the kids are eligible for free meals, not reduced. And about 16% of our kids are English language learners. Again, much greater at the elementary level. It's about 23%. So we're very, very diverse. And it's fascinating to do this work around equity and social justice in a community that has true diversity and that is essentially run and controlled by affluent white people. And how you, but claims itself to be and is probably the most, you know, I tell people I am the superintendent of the bluest county in the bluest state, right? But the historical institutions and culture that exist is really fascinating to try to navigate these issues of social justice and equity throughout. So Montgomery County Public Schools has a long and rich tradition of doing very well academically. It's a well-regarded school system. I got here 3.5 years ago, being superintendent of schools in Stamford, Connecticut, which was 1/10 of the size. It looked very similar demographically and was frankly a broken system that needed to be fixed. And it's been fascinating to figure out how to take a great system where, you know, highest graduation rate for African Americans in the country. We have more African Americans and Latinos kids who are taking advanced placement classes and scoring a 3 or above or doing well in the SAT than anybody else out there. But how do you take it to the next level? And I'll describe a little bit about how we're doing that. So the first is to define what kids need to know and be able to do in the future, right? And as was mentioned before in my introduction, in my bio, there are 3 areas we're focused on. The first is, of course, academics, right? That's the only thing I'm accountable for. The only thing I'm accountable for is academics. So we measure it not only in state tests, which is necessary, but also advanced placement, SAT, international baccalaureate, et cetera. The second is the idea of creative problem solving, right? When I talk to industry leaders all the time, they don't tell me they want kids who have a good GPA, although GPA is the greatest predictor of college success, by the way. They tell me that they want people who are problem solvers and curious and can work well in teams and can collaborate. They have to have technical skills, but they need people who have great creative problem solving skills. And the third piece is social emotional well-being, and the idea that our kids need to understand how to live in a multicultural society. They have to learn how to resolve conflict. We have a lot of kids who the resilience that they exhibit every day in just getting to school is remarkable, given what they have to deal with at home and given their family situations. But we also have a lot of kids who are affluent or just simply middle class who have absolutely no idea how to navigate and negotiate an increasingly complex world. I say all the time, you know, I have 3 of my own kids. I very much expect them to be straight A students. I'm losing that battle already, but I expect them to be straight A students, and I expect them to be great people. And if I had to choose, I'd rather have them be, you know, average students and great people than average people and great students. And so the idea of social emotional well-being is learning how to set goals, have hope, you know, and we actually measure this. We measure hope and we measure engagement. We measure student well-being, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we have, let me tell you about the 5 strategies we use to get there, and then I'll kind of go a little deeper into the equity work that we're doing. The first is, and these are not in priority order, the first is equitable funding and resources. So we give more money where there's more need, right? We give about $2,200 more to the schools that have greater poverty. And it goes to smaller class sizes, it goes to parent and family coordination and outreach, it goes to more reading and math, it goes to more social workers, it depends. We try to give schools more now than we ever used to before, more flexibility in how to use that. But we give more where there's a greater need, because that's what equity is all about. The second is curriculum and you know, really rigorous curriculum and culturally proficient pedagogy. So the idea is that we have to make sure we have a really rigorous curriculum, and we have to make sure that our kids are able to access the kind of curriculum that will get them into the University of Maryland or another 4-year college, whatever it may be, wherever they come from. And we also know that our teachers have to be equipped to understand who kids are and where they come from. And so we've been doing a lot of work on equity training and ensuring that our teachers are culturally proficient. So we now hire for values, right? We have in our hiring practices, if you don't have the values that we have, you will not work in Montgomery County Public Schools. And our values are learning, relationships, respect, equity, and excellence. If you go on our website, you can see all this. But we hire for it. We train people in cultural proficiency. We expect it. We talk about it a lot. We very explicitly talk about race and the impact of race on families, on students, on teachers. We have a really robust sort of systems and processes, some architecture to instill equity within schools and to help school communities talk about issues of race and equity. And again, it's just simply expected, and we evaluate people as well. Our teacher evaluation in the 6 standards, one of them speaks very explicitly about equity. So if you are not meeting our standards in terms of how you relate to people and how you think about your kids, then you can be evaluated out of Montgomery County Public Schools. We've started a Equity Warrior certificate program. Equity Warrior is the term of art, but it's an actual certificate program with McDaniel College to train teachers who want to really embed equity into their everyday practices and become leaders. It started as a certificate program, but they're actually going to turn it into a degree-bearing program. It's pretty cool. And our union was the one who initiated it. Our teachers union was the one who initiated it. The third piece is human capital management, right? It's all about people. I have 23,000 employees, and the #1 equity strategy is people. You know, you can have all the programs you want, you can have all the curriculum you want, but if you don't have the right people in the right place doing the right work, then you're not going to get there. The fourth is community engagement, and we've built up a really big arm, a community engagement arm, and it's in different ways. So, you know, part of it is just trying to communicate with people in all different sorts of ways and bring people in. But we've started community engagement teams, which are teams that go into our neediest areas of town and really try to work with families there. We call it Where They Are initiative. So, you know, I went to our mobile home park just to talk to the parents and the kids about what's going on there. And the idea is go to people. Right now, superintendent going is very, very minor, right? You got to have people, social workers and you know, teachers and principals, but you got to go to where people are. We do food markets now in our schools, so that because we have a lot of people who have hunger issues, so we've partnered with capital area food banks to do food markets. And the idea is you bring people in to get food, which they need for the weekend, but you try to engage them in helping them understand, you know, plug them into the school, right? So community engagement, and then the other piece around it is deliberate, intentional linking interagency collaboration with our Department of Health and Human Services, as well as recreation. So housing and transportation and food insecurity are 3 of the biggest issues in Montgomery County. I don't control any of them. But what I did was I built an early warning indicator system, so that I looked at the dropouts from 2011. We back mapped to 1st grade to understand what the patterns are that exist at the earliest level, so that you can actually intervene quickly. So we've just launched this predictive analytics system that enables us to identify kids at a very early stage who might be falling through the cracks. And I'm now going to the county, I'm saying, look, you know, I can do something in the schoolhouse, but if people are moving around because, you know, there's no affordable housing, or they just got a job, you know, finally, and they have to move, I can't do anything about that. You need to help. So part of our community engagement work is through interagency collaboration. And then the final piece is just the idea of continuous improvement, the idea and accountability, that we have to continually be improving and getting better at what we do, while trying to avoid the sort of return on investment trap and the kind of current. I'm a former accountability guy, or I'm a recovering accountability guy, and the accountability sort of conversation in this country is so damaging to public education. We have to be accountable for what we do, but the way it's talked about now is so problematic. And so we're looking at our data, you know, as I always say, look at data for 2 reasons: use it to name names and use it to ask better questions. At best, the data help you ask better questions. So we're trying to, you know, we're constantly working on continuous improvement and holding ourselves accountable, but we have to do it in ways that that actually comport with best practices. So let me just wrap up on this last piece. It's interesting that, you know, the social justice kind of angle through a lot of the conversations that have been going on in this conference. And when I first got to Montgomery County, I tried to convince people to think about two things. One was, someone mentioned the achievement gap earlier. And I am of the belief that we need to think more about the education debt. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with Gloria Ladson-Billings' I think it was 2008 AERA presidential speech where she talked about the education debt. And the idea is that the deficit, like the achievement gap, measures your annual, your intake versus your output, right, which is important. But there's a debt that we owe to people in this country who have been kept out of all the things that enable you to achieve the American dream. And if we don't, we have to think about that as much as we just think about the annual difference in test scores, right? And we've always had a debt. And I tried to convince people, and I lost big time. But when we were going through our values work, going from 11 sort of mushy values to 5 really strong core values, I tried to convince people that the next level of equity work was social justice, right? And the way I think about it, and the way I try to talk about it in our community, which then I hope spurs some innovation and spurs other people to act, is that equity is the recognition that there's a different, you have to level the playing field, right? That you have to make sure you provide resources to those that need more to get to where we need them to get to so that kids can graduate, all kids can graduate college and career ready, right? Absolutely essential and necessary, and you can organize around that, and we have Montgomery County. But social justice actually acknowledges that wrongs were done, right? And there's a history of wrongs done by government, by government institutions. And despite my desire to claim otherwise, I am a government institution, right? I won't go so far as to say I'm the man, but I call snow days, so that's got to give me something, right? Again, I'm trying to make a joke. It's not going over very well. Too serious of a crowd, the academics. So the issue of you actually have to recognize all the wrongs that have been done in education, in by government institutions throughout our country to then figure out, okay, what do I need to do going forward? Right? What do I need to do going forward? And I'll just give you one quick example of how we've taken this on in Montgomery County to some good results. Has anybody read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow? Raise your hand. Couple. All right. Well, thank you. Couple. All right. So Michelle Alexander wrote this book maybe 2 years ago. Provides this really, really compelling analysis and of how the war on drugs is essentially equivalent to Jim Crow, right? And just draws this really straight line between slavery and Jim Crow, the war on drugs, in terms of keeping African American males, and particularly out of society. Right, and it's a really powerful book. I encourage you to read it. So last year, last year I talked about it with all my administrators, 800 people, whatever, at the beginning of the year, and I said, you should read it. It's powerful. I used to work with kids coming out of jail in residential treatment centers, and I also worked with severely emotionally disturbed adolescents in Brooklyn. And well understood how these kids were being screwed, frankly, by the system. Right, it's kind of what led me to become a superintendent in many ways. So what I said to folks was, look, we know we have disproportionality in suspensions. In Montgomery County, we don't suspend as many kids as other places, but we know there's disproportionality, right? And so we use that book and some other work to then say, okay, what do we need to do, right? What do we need to do to make sure that we keep kids in school? Because you can't send the message to a kid, you've done something wrong, go home and fix yourself, and then come back, right? It doesn't actually work. You actually have to pull the kid in closer and say, you know what, I'm going to help you. I'm not going to accept your behavior, but I'm going to help you. That's my job as an adult. So by virtue of sort of, and this is what's great about being superintendent, frankly, and then being superintendent in a place like Montgomery County that has wonderful resources and incredible capacity and a deep commitment and ethos around this kind of work. I said it, by the end of the year, we'd reduce discretionary suspensions by 50%. Right, so discretionary suspensions are the ones that are not for you're dealing drugs, you brought in a weapon, but it's the, I don't like the way you looked at me, right? Kind of suspensions, which people do, and kids get suspended for disrespect. And it sent a really powerful message to our community as well as to our educators that the number one thing you can do with kids, and if anybody is familiar with all the research on resilience and having done my dissertation on at-risk youth and interagency collaboration, when you look at all the research done on resilience, a lot of which is done on kids coming from war-torn areas, at least in the 80s it was, relationships with adults is like the number one thing. And it ideally would be the parent, but if it's not a parent, it can be a coach, it can be a teacher, it can be a building service manager, it can be a security guard, but one adult can make a huge impact. And so when we think about operationalizing the social justice work, and all the policies and the budgets and the work that I have to do to organize the architecture of it, what it fundamentally comes down to for us and how we've seen an increase in graduation rates, an increase in SAT and AP scores, and a reduction in suspensions, right, and happier kids, because we do measure that, right, is simply through pushing the idea that relationships with kids is something that you can do to have a powerful impact. And so as I think about, the work you're doing internationally, to think about all this craziness that goes on with how we think about public education, and how we think about the rights that kids have to education, I wonder what it would mean if we just focused our efforts on building relationships with kids, right? Not their test scores necessarily, that comes later, but building the relationships with kids and with community, right? In ways that I think we are sorely missing in public education. So in Montgomery County, we're trying to organize around that. We're starting to see some good results, but it's so far, at least it resonates with folks, and I think we do have happier kids than we did before. We'll see how it translates on the new Common Core assessments that'll be coming down the pike in a few months, which I know you're all familiar with. So with that, I'll take my leave up here and answer any questions.
Thank you to both of the presenters. I'm going to open it up to questions now. If you do have a question, I ask that maybe you stand just because the room is so large, so the acoustics might not be great. I also am a portable mic, so I can come to you if you like. Oh, you have one. Great. They have one in the back. So does anyone have a question?
Or comments.
Or comments? Yes. I mean, wide a range from international to sort of local politics and issues. Arnie Danzig, thank you. There's a mic right behind you coming.
So this is to Joshua. So it seems to me if you follow the data on student achievement, the PISA and the TIMSS results, they all suggest that the comparisons with the United States schools is an unfair comparison. And if you compare certain groups, certain strata in the United States with countries across the world, that the comparisons are much fairer and American schools do much better. And I seem to remember reading about Montgomery County schools having done a lot to change the composition of schools so that, single ethnic group schools are reduced and the balance and the mix of populations in schools were changed, and the results of that on the performance, the achievement, the engagements of kids have changed dramatically. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so Rick Collenberg did, and I'm trying to remember his colleague, did a study a while back, this is before my time, about Montgomery County. It's interesting how that study has taken on a life of its own in the sense that there was some factual basis to some integration work that went on. But Montgomery County has an espoused housing policy, low-income housing policy, integrated housing policy, but it doesn't actually play out in the way that people think it does. It doesn't have the impact that people think it does, meaning not as many folks as one might think. Over the time, and this all preceded me, there were certainly some efforts, and there have been some efforts to integrate schools through magnet programs and choice programs, and what I now describe as a whack-a-mole strategy, because there was a lot of money and it was just sort of thrown at different programs without a real clear theory of action around what it's intended to do. But there are, in fact, we do know that African American, Latino, and students in free and reduced price meals tend to do better in more integrated schools. Tend to do better, which is consistent with some of the national data. The issue we have is housing segregation in Montgomery County. And so we're facing a question about what do you do, right? What do you do around that going forward when people want to live in certain areas? And what we're trying to do is, of course, lift the quality of all schools. And in fact, that's working pretty well. So what that study describes is not indicative of the entire system, although it does describe some elements of it. And it's been interesting how many folks know Montgomery County through that study, but it doesn't, frankly, reflect the reality today in lots of ways, although there is some truth to it. Does that answer the question?
This question is for Dr. Starr. My name is Brian Wilkins, Assistant Principal, St. Lucie County Schools, Florida. You mentioned your evaluation, and if teachers don't have those values that you look for to build those relationships with students, that's what you look for. My question, because we experience in St. Lucie County, teacher shortage. What kind of recruitment process do you have in place in Montgomery County?
Right. So they come to us. I mean, Montgomery County has always, we have an amazing caliber of people, frankly. Part is we're big. Part of it is we pay well, we compensate well, we have great working conditions, we support our people, we train them. We invest about $39,000 in a teacher the first 5 years of their time with us. So we do your standard recruiting, with job fairs and whatever else, but we do not have an issue with that, frankly. What we're working on now is workforce diversity, and we're going to be launching a plan in 2 weeks around that, because 75% of our teaching population is white women, and they're wonderful. I mean, I have nothing against white women, but another joke. Thank you. But we're trying to get much more diverse and reflect the makeup of the county and all that. But we do not have a recruiting issue because people want to work in Montgomery County.
Moving to a more national scale, superintendents, for example, I'm in Florida, when they were adopting the Florida Principal Leadership Standards, there were several superintendents that didn't want social justice included within those standards. So what is it that you see as superintendents? What kind of movement is happening within the profession to move social justice onto the plate for superintendents? Because you might actually be an anomaly in terms of superintendents who are placing social justice square and center in terms of their vision.
So I think there are more and more superintendents that are speaking up. I chair the Large County, I'm co-chair of Large County School District Consortium, which is made up of about 16 districts similar to Montgomery County. So we're trying to get Hillsborough, for example, that kind of county to be part of it, Fairfax, places like that. And there are a lot of superintendents that privately will speak to the issue of social justice a lot. But publicly, the politics are such that it can be very, very difficult. I chose to go to Montgomery County. I mean, they chose me as well, but because of the values, right? And because I can do the work and speak how I want to speak because of the values of the community and of the school board. But if I were in a different community, I may have to do it in different ways. And in my previous community, which again looked just like Montgomery County, but had deep, deep tracking and race issues. I mean, when I detracked the Stanford Public Schools, people, the vitriol levied at me, the nastiness that came out. When I would, so I once had a school board member in my previous district say, when I would say, so it's our black kids and our Latino kids are not achieving where our white kids are, they would say, you have to stop talking about race. And I would say, it's not, it's the No Child Left Behind category, right? Or they would say, stop, I had one board member say, stop using the term people of color because you offend others. I said, so what should I say, right? So where did Shanker say, where you stand is where you sit, and the politics of the job are such that it can be difficult to speak the truth, speak your truth in lots of ways. I think is one aspect of it, and then I think the other piece is we are oftentimes fall into the traps of bureaucracy and administration rather than leadership, which I find a great source of frustration, frankly, among some of my colleagues.
This is actually a good segue to ask Felicia about this, because you'd mentioned that most of your speaking is not in the United States, and in the United States we generally think about human rights violations as happening elsewhere and not actually in our own country. And part of the reason why is the conference co-chairs, and actually it was Azadeh who kind of insisted on this language around human rights, and most of us, we weren't as familiar with it. We had the racial justice piece, but we didn't see what it would mean to kind of put that into a human rights frame. And so, because that's often thought about as something elsewhere. We don't violate human rights. And so I'm wondering what you think about in terms of some of the challenges of actually doing and using the framework of human rights and notions of violations of human rights in the United States, and what some of our barriers are and how we might kind of further that discourse beyond the human rights education that happens with children, but actually the kind of work that we actually have to do with adults as well.
It's a great question, thank you for that. And I think if I take a wider frame, because you've invited me to do so, I think that there are a number of organizations in the United States, including ones you've probably heard of, like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch and others, and the US Human Rights Network, by the way, who are trying to reframe challenges in the US environment through the use of the human rights terminology. And a fair question is, what's the value added of that? If we know it's a problem, then what's the point of calling it a human rights violation? So, and we were talking earlier about the difference between social justice and human rights, for example, and what's the relationship there. So a brief rendering of what we were talking about there is that social justice is casts a wider net, and it has to do, under social justice you can speak about lots of norms and social change, and it has to do with economic redistribution. Human rights is a piece of that. And the human rights element of social justice has to do specifically with the legal framework. So the value added of talking about all of these challenges in the U.S., from whether it's in the U.S. educational system or challenges to having affordable housing or what have you, is because there is accountability somewhere there. I mean, Joshua is obviously someone who's very deeply committed to the values of equity and social justice. He's accountable to himself, actually, in addition to his responsibilities as a superintendent. But the human rights framework is about being able to use laws and courts and other forms of monitoring and accountability so that governments do their job better. It sounds like it's always antagonistic, but it's not necessarily, because even in the United States, in the education system in particular, working for human rights change, whether you call it the right to education or curriculum reform, which is what I'm mostly focused on, you only work with people who are interested in it. You can't oppose that. People have to be believers, just as Joshua is. So I think the value added in using the human rights framework here in the States and looking in and not just out is the potential to apply those elaborated standards, because there's been a lot of attention put into what does the right to education look like, what does the right to housing look like, affordable wage, and thinking that there are standards that are external to the states, but also there's some harmonization in the laws here, but there's always gaps. Human rights is a kind of utopia, right? So it's just another way of keeping our eye on the ball, if you will. And there are mechanisms associated with the human rights legal framework, like reporting to the UN, the Universal Periodic Review, which you may not have heard of, but there's a US Human Rights Educators Network that I'm part of, and we organized a consultation on the status of human rights education in US schools. And there are mechanisms like that we can use to help sort of nudge things forward, if you will. So, but it's a big leap for a lot of people in the States. Civil and political rights is the language we're accustomed to learning about. The civil rights movement was a human rights movement, but that's not something you hear very often, So Part of it's just, it's the history of the U.S., it's how we've learned to think about rights. The U.S. has been right out in front in civil and political rights, but then there's these social, economic, and cultural rights. And again, the added benefit, I think, has to do with accountability and advocacy. And otherwise, there's lots of ways for us to work for social change, and the human rights way is just one of them.
Hello, thank you. Whoa, thank you. My question is piggybacking after Dr. Dumas's question. My name is Melinda Lemke. I'm from UT Education Policy and Planning Program. I'm wondering, not only is there this vitriolic reaction to social justice and human rights issues, particularly in certain parts of the US, like Texas, but there's also co-optation of language around human rights and social justice. And recently, Wales they're the first nation in the world to have adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into their national system. I mean, it's a huge achievement. And so I'm wondering, not only in terms of education, but what can we do in terms of policy, right? In trying to incorporate language into policy at the national level or at the state level, and what would be your recommendations for that route?
Is that directed towards me?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, thank you.
Sure. Steve, you said a lot in your question, actually, and it was an observation as well as a question, and I appreciate both of those elements. First is that, although I work I work exclusively now. I didn't always work exclusively in the human rights field, but now I do. I agree with you that human rights language can be co-opted, that in fact lots of times it becomes associated with a particular political party, and the challenge here in the United States is partly around that human rights can be associated with progressivism, and